Я маю сказати, що ми дякуємо, як Київська школа економіки, ми дякуємо донорам, які включають Dragon, Stockholm School of Economics, USAID, UK, Tapas Project, Dragon Capital, Visa, and Liga for making this event possible. We'll have 3 lectures. One will be, I'll introduce each of the speakers, but we're really happy to start with Pol Mілгром. I expect Paul to receive Nobel Prize in not maybe this year, I don't know when, but we really have been waiting for this for 10 years now, maybe, because the first, well, I'm not going to go into that, but it's been a long time overdue, and Paul will talk about radio spectrum reallocation and clock auctions. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Sorry we're running a little bit late. I understand this is mostly an audience of professionals, so you'll see some of the slides I'll skip over, which are perhaps more technical than is appropriate for this group. But I wanted to begin by talking to you about what the problem was that we were dealing with here. So I'm going to tell you first about the incentive auction. This was the real radio spectrum reallocation problem that we were solving in the United States. And since many of you don't even know what radio spectrum is, I'm going to begin with a video here. And hopefully you'll be able to hear it.
Electromagnetic spectrum, or just spectrum, is the huge range of wireless frequencies used for all sorts of different things. From X-rays to microwaves, garage door openers and baby monitors to broadcast television. Everything wireless uses spectrum. There's a certain part of spectrum that is particularly useful for various technologies. This spectrum is licensed by the government to different users so that the signals don't interfere with each other. Companies that run satellites, radio, mobile phones, and broadcast television all license different parts of spectrum. But what we want to really focus on is spectrum that's part of the broadcast spectrum incentive auction. The process for this auction begins in late 2015 and will involve the FCC buying some of the licensed spectrum from broadcast television and then selling it to wireless broadband companies. 5 years ago, the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, proposed the idea for an auction in the National Broadband Plan. Congress authorized the FCC to proceed a couple of years later. And for the last few years, the FCC has been sketching out the detailed and involved rules for this first ever incentive auction. There are 3 interrelated components to this process. There's a reverse auction, where broadcasters will voluntarily decide whether or not to sell their spectrum rights to the FCC. Broadcasters will bid downward against each other to give up their spectrum. At the same time, wireless broadband providers will bid upward in a forward auction to buy that spectrum. Finally, there's repacking, a mandatory nationwide process where all broadcasters that stay on the air may be required to move to new channels. The FCC will begin the auction process later this year, with station applications to participate due by December 18th. The actual auction will start on March 29th, 2016, and will take somewhere between a few weeks and a few months. After the auction is completed, likely in the early summer of 2016, the FCC will announce the results and everyone's new channel assignments. Why is this happening? It's to really address wireless industry demand for spectrum, to increase broadband availability in the country, and to generate revenue for a number of government initiatives. Because the difference between what is paid in a forward auction and what is paid out in the reverse will be kept by the government for these purposes. Who will it affect? In terms of the voluntary auction, nearly every station will get an opening offer to sell, but ultimately, the FCC is expected to buy spectrum in large markets, geographically adjacent markets, or congested markets where there are a lot of broadcasters. As for the repacking, that will be a mandatory nationwide process that could affect any station on any channel in any market.
Okay, so that's what this was about. Now, from the discussions we've been having earlier today, it appears that there's some need for spectrum reallocation in Ukraine as well. And so perhaps there are some generalizable lessons here, although what I'm going to talk about is very specific to the particular application that we were dealing with, clearing broadcast television channels and reallocating spectrum for mobile broadband. So, and by the way, the auction took a little longer than the regulator, than whoever made that video anticipated. It was completed in April of 2017, and the forward auction revenues were about $20 billion. The broadcasters in the reverse auction received about $10 billion. The difference, the $10 billion difference, was used partly to pay other broadcasters that needed to retune their channels and get new equipment, and partly as net revenue to the government. The highest price for a single television station, a station in Chicago, got $304 million. Participants included both commercial and non-commercial stations, religious broadcasters, educational channels, and so on. Also were selling spectrum in the auction. 11 non-commercial stations each received more than $100 million. This is my local San Francisco public television station. It owned 3 broadcast channels and sold one of them, and rejiggered its, multiplexed its signals on the remaining 2 so that it lost basically no service at all to its customers. Spent a couple $1 million on equipment and got $95 million for the channel that it made available. There was a lot of spectrum cleared, 84 megahertz in total, of which 70 megahertz was used in mobile broadband and 14 megahertz for unlicensed uses. For those of you who know something about spectrum, that's a reasonably large amount. This is low frequency spectrum in the 600 megahertz band. This talk is going to be about the reverse auction, because the reverse auction, you know, for a research talk, this is one of the main things I talk about because it's the most novel part of what we did. The other novel part of what, whoops, I thought I put this in here. I guess it didn't come, okay. Not sure why it's not there. This talk is going to emphasize the reverse auction. And I want to say first a few words about why the emphasis on the reverse auction and what a hard problem this was. This was something that occupied us for a long time. This is a map of the United States and Canada up here, and each dot in this map represents the location of a television station. There were about 3,000 of them. Some of the dots are actually stacked. For example, in Chicago, essentially all the television stations are at the same location on the top of the Sears Tower. So there's about 3,000 television stations. And there's an arc or a line in this graph whenever 2 stations can't be assigned to the same channel without causing interference. And so this graph gives you an idea of what the repacking problem looked like. There's about 130,000 of these co-channel constraints, that is, arcs, in this representation. This is a reduced representation of the real problem, but it's good enough for our purposes. And this is a mathematically hard problem. Those of you who've studied computer science know about the so-called NP-complete problems. These are problems for which there don't exist fast algorithms, roughly speaking. And the graph coloring problem is such a problem. This is a problem of the classical graph coloring problem is, given a graph, can I color each node so that no 2 connected nodes are the same color? Here the problem is, can I assign a channel to each station such that no 2 connected stations are on the same channel? It's the same problem, okay? This is only an approximation of the problem, but it's a pretty good approximation and gives you an idea that this is a large-scale graph coloring problem, and therefore we don't even have algorithms that can tell us whether it's possible to assign a given set of stations to a given set of channels and solve that problem quickly. So it's a little sensitive. So how many people know what a Vickrey auction is? Okay, only a small fraction of you. That's too bad. Okay, so before I was hired, the proposal was to run this auction, which is a Nobel Prize winning idea. It's an auction. It's the only auction that has the property that that it provides bidders incentives to report their station values truthfully. That once they report their station values truthfully, it selects the optimal allocation and then computes prices in a way that provides an incentive for them to report truthfully so that bidders will want to do so. I've left out a little few details there that the technical people know about, but that roughly is what the Vickrey auction is. And they had the idea that they were going to try to do this for a reverse auction. I'm going to tell you 7 reasons why that's a bad idea, and I'm going to tell you what we did that solved all 7 of those problems. So the first problem is a computational problem, and again, since so few of you know what a Vickrey auction is, I won't belabor the point. There's a computation you have to do to calculate prices in a Vickrey auction that involves optimizing the set of stations, feasible stations that stay on the air, and the problem is that we can't solve that optimization problem, and that if you make even small errors in the optimization, for example, with 2,000 stations, if you make a 1% error, which would be a very low error in one of these problems, the price will be off by 1% of the value of 2,000 stations. So the price will be off by, roughly speaking, the value of 20 average stations. So I could be offering Preston here a price that's off by an amount that's 20 times the value of an average station. It's way too big an error for this to be practical. So the first reason not to run Vickrey auction is we can't compute Vickrey prices. The second reason is that it requires too much trust. So I want you to imagine that I am trying to run an auction and you own a television station somewhere, and I'm trying to encourage you to participate. And so I write a letter to you. I need, basically, for a successful auction, I need all of you to participate, or very nearly all of you. I'm trying to clear a lot of spectrum, and you have the plausible option, in some cases, of not participating at all. I don't want any of you to make that decision. So I write a letter to you, and it says, "Dear Mr. Broadcaster, we've heard your concerns about the complexity of the spectrum reallocation process. You may even be unsure about whether to participate or how much to bid. To make things as easy as possible for you, we've adopted a Nobel Prize-winning auction procedure called the Vickrey auction. In this auction, all you need to do is tell us what your broadcast rights are worth to you. We'll figure out whether you're a winner, and if so, how much to pay to buy your rights." It's probably even worse in Ukraine than it is in the US to say this, but there you are. Just tell me what it's worth to you. The rules will ensure that it's in your interest to report truthfully. That's the magic of the Vickrey auction. If I run it honestly, of course. But not only if I run it honestly, I can't guarantee that the very hard computations we do will be exactly correct. Talk about an opening for corruption, right? And the law forbids us to share the information that you would need to check the calculations. So how many of you are going to tell me the value of your station? We think that this is just not a viable proposal for that second reason. And there's 7 more reasons that are, rather 7 reasons in total. If we have a limited procurement budget, there's a limited amount that we can pay to acquire stations. Well, that's a budget constraint, and it's well known that you can't create a Vickrey auction that always respects a budget constraint. It's a single auction. It can't be tuned to balance cost and efficiency objectives. It may produce a high price vector, higher than any market clearing price vector. It reveals extra information about winners' values, which actually is a theoretical property that wasn't too important in this auction. It's subject to possible collusion. That is, bidders could get together, and even without making monetary transfers among each other, they might have joint deviations where they coordinated their bidding and where they were all better off. I'm going to show an auction design to you that doesn't have any of these problems. Okay? So that's that was the big advantage. So what I'm not going to talk about in any detail is I'm just going to talk about the reverse auction. What the video didn't mention, and what I won't talk about in much detail today except on this one slide, is how we decided how much spectrum to clear. And deciding how much spectrum to clear depended on bids in the forward auction that say, how much are the buyers willing to pay, and bids in the reverse auction saying how much are the sellers willing to accept. And we went through a process, again, that today I won't describe in detail, that attempted to find a market clearing quantity of spectrum so that we could raise enough money in the forward auction to pay the buyers in the reverse auction. And this is the actual algorithm, and we're going to skip over that and instead focus on the the reverse auction problem. The solution that we had, and by the way, I'm going to simplify a little bit in the discussion here, because actually there was, I'm going to describe this as though each TV station had a separate owner. We had other issues that are significant and would take longer to talk about stations, owners that own multiple stations. So I'm going to do this presentation today as though each station were owned separately. And the first thing I'm going to tell you about is how to think about these things algorithmically. So the first question is an algorithmic one. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to think of the spectrum reallocation problem as being partly a packing problem. That is, given a set of stations, find the feasible subset of those stations that should continue to broadcast. Once we've decided how many channels we're limiting ourselves to, broadcast in this more limited set of channels to maximize the total value of the stations remaining on the air. That's the mathematical formulation. Each station N has a value Vn. There's some collection of feasible subsets, script F. This is an example of a feasible subset. And the goal is to maximize, by choosing a feasible subset, the sum of the value of the stations in that subset. Okay? And so that problem resembles a classic problem in computer science and operations research known as the knapsack problem. The knapsack problem looks almost the same. We're choosing a set of stations to maximize value, and the feasible sets of stations are determined by this inequality constraint. So each of these little SNs represents the size. The knapsack problem, the idea is that you go into a store and you're given a knapsack and you say, anything you can put in the knapsack you can walk out of the store with. And so what you're trying to do is put into there the most valuable things you can, but you're limited by the size of the knapsack. So the sum of the sizes of the items has to be no more than the capacity of the knapsack. Okay, that's the classic knapsack problem, which is a special case of the problem I wrote down for you. And George Danzig, a famous man who really should have won a Nobel Prize many years ago in the 1950s, proposed, and this, by the way, is an NP-hard problem. This is an example of a problem that if you're trying to solve it exactly, it's really hard to solve. Should I take the most valuable item? It's too big, it doesn't leave room for the second and third most valuable items, maybe that's better. You have to consider all the combinations. But Danzig said, you know, you can do pretty well approximately by doing this. Just take each item and look at its value per unit size, value per cubic meter, if you will. So take value divided by size, and take the item that has the highest value per unit size and put it in the knapsack if it fits. And then go on to the next item and put it in the knapsack if it still fits. And if something doesn't fit, set it aside and just keep going that way. And so this is, you know, it's like when you're going on a trip and you're putting important things in your trunk. You know, you put in the most important things first, taking into account value and size. And this gets you close to the optimum. And mathematically, here's an expression about how close. I won't go over that for you today, but it often gets you pretty close to the optimum. So why am and this is called, by the way, a greedy algorithm. It's greedy in the sense that you don't really look ahead and study the whole problem. Instead, you just take the most valuable thing and put it in if there's room, and then look at the next thing, and you don't sort of look ahead and plan in order to optimize. Now, why am I telling you about greedy algorithms in connection with auctions? Because auctions are greedy algorithms. And so here is an example, and again, this is done pretty mathematically. These slides are really for an audience of professors. But the idea is that what you do is you set a high price for each station separately, or for each item separately, that's proportional to its size. And then you start reducing that constant of proportionality. So I say, you know, Preston, yours is size 2, and Jeremy, yours is size 1, and Peter's is size 1/2. And I start out with a price of 10 per unit size, and so I offer 20 to Preston, and 10 to Jeremy, and 5 to Peter. And then I start lowering those prices proportionately until one of them says, well, no, that's too low, I'm going to stay on the air. And then I lower the prices some more until somebody else does. until there's no more room to put people on the air. And what that does is it ends up taking the guy who has the highest value per unit size and packs him first, and takes the next highest value per unit size and packs him next. It basically, the auction implements a greedy algorithm. That's what it does. Okay? And the theorem is if bidders bid straightforwardly in such an auction, then the set of bidders selected to continue broadcasting is identical to those selected by Danzig's greedy algorithm. In fact, it selects the bidders in the same order. It's essentially the same process. It's just represented as an auction. So the first thing you need to know is that that auction, at least, is the same as a greedy algorithm, and that gives us the mathematical basis for studying it. Let's see how I'm doing on time here. Okay, pretty good. All right, so for the theorists out there, here's the full class of descending clock auctions. That's not the auction I'm going to use because I don't have sizes for the stations. But here, there's a whole class of auctions that also correspond to different kinds of greedy algorithms. And what happens in each of these, they happen in discrete time, not continuous time. So I take station 1, period 2, period 3. And at each period, there's some set of bidders that's still active that say, yeah, I'd consider accepting that price. And at each period, there's a history, which is how many people were active in each of the previous periods. And the active bidders at each round is a subset of the round before. That is, bidders drop out gradually during this auction. And we have some set of possible histories. And here's what a clock auction is. It's a rule that says, as a function of the history, how should I set the price for the next round? So after every history, at round T, I set some price for the still active stations that's no higher than the price that I set at the previous round. That's what makes this a descending clock auction. And the rule I used, each different rule defines a different auction. So each such function describes an auction. That's the class of descending clock auctions. Okay, and the rules of the auction is that each active bidder, you guys have television stations to sell. Each of you has a chance. Every time I quote a price, I say to you $30 million, and you say, yes, I would take $30 million if you offered it to me, or no, I wouldn't, I'm going to keep my television station, and then you become inactive. You're out of the auction. Okay, so that's what happens. Each bidder either says, I would take that price if you gave it to me, or it says, sorry, I'm out. And the prices continue. Now, it may happen that after some round, I've offered you $30 million, and I said, well, more people said yes than I needed, so I'm going to lower the prices. I'm only offering you $27 million this round. Are you still willing to say yes? And we go on and on like that. And the auction ends when there's no more prices changing. I say, at this point, I say, fine, I'm happy. I'm not going to change the prices anymore. Those of you who are still active, now that I'm not changing the prices anymore, you're the winners. I'm going to pay you. I'm going to buy your station. The rest of the stations are going to stay on the air. Okay, that's how this auction worked. Is that clear? Okay. So, and the computational burden that I had with the Vickery auction, where I had to solve these big optimization problems, that is substantially alleviated here. I can use any heuristic I want in defining this auction P. Now, this is still computationally challenging because I have to tell whether it's feasible to buy a set of stations, and I've already told you that was an NP-hard problem. During the real auction, I had to solve 10,000 problems, roughly, of that size, and there doesn't exist an algorithm that can always answer those questions. So what we did in the real auction is we said, well, if we can tell that that there's room for your station on the air, we'll lower your price. And if we can't tell, we're just going to treat it like it's not possible to put your station on the air, and we'll buy it. So there was a lot of technical work, even in this auction, but it's substantially simpler, and I'll show you that in the simulations, just how much simpler it is. Okay. The next thing I'm going to do, this is technical, and I guess I'll take a moment to give you guys the technical background. This is really work by Sheng-Wu Lee, currently at Harvard, who did this partly because he was watching what we were doing. He was a student of mine and did this partly because he was watching what we were doing in the incentive auction. But his idea was to say, what would it mean for it to be obvious to bidders about how to bid? And I'm not going to go over the slides. Technical people, you can read the slides if you like, or you can read it in the paper. But he says, what would it mean for it to be obvious? What it would mean for it to be obvious is that how to bid is obvious if when you consider what to bid, and when you consider at any given point, and you would consider what others might do, it doesn't matter what others might do. No matter, the worst thing that can happen to you if you follow the rule is is at least as good as the best thing, at least as good as the best thing that can happen to you if you deviate. That's what it means to be obvious. So in the example here, I offer you $30 million for your TV station. Your TV station is worth $5 million to you, and you have no idea what anybody else is going to do, and you don't even know how the rules of the auction, how I even come up with these numbers. But you know that if I say $30 million, you should say yes. Because if you say no, the best thing that can happen to you is that you get zero. And if you say yes, the worst thing that can happen to you is that you get zero. So it's obvious. It's obviously strategy proof. So that's the idea, that this doesn't require you to have a lot of trust that I'm doing the calculation correctly and that other people aren't cheating. It just doesn't matter. It's just obvious that the best thing to do is to report truthfully. Okay? So the theorems about this auction is that for any bidder who has just one station to sell, every descending clock auction is obviously strategy proof. Everything in this class looks this way from your perspective, and so all of them are strategy proof. All of them are obviously strategy proof. And not only that, if you have a group of people, if these guys over here each have a station and they talk to each other and say, hey, maybe we can collude and all of us do better without side payments. If they pay each other, they can do better. But suppose it's a country like the US, I'm not sure how good your detection rules are here, where paying money has paper trails. You like to collude without paying money. Is there any way to do that profitably? Well, the answer is no. There is no way for these guys to deviate that makes them all better off. And why is that? Well, suppose that, Preston talks to Jeremy and says, Jeremy, you should really deviate. You're the first guy who has to deviate. It's a clock auction. At some point, somebody's got to be the first who needs to deviate. Jeremy, you're the first that needs to deviate. You should do something else because I'm gonna make it worth your while. Well, obviously, strategy proof says it doesn't matter what Preston does. He can't possibly benefit by deviating. The first guy to deviate has to be worse off because the auction's obviously strategy proof. It doesn't matter what anybody else does. If he deviates, he's going to be worse off, even if Preston will behave differently and try to reward him. So this auction is both obviously strategy proof and group strategy proof. Okay, and these properties still apply even if I screw up the computations. Remember, this is a descending clock auction, and every descending clock auction has these properties. So if the computations are hard and I get them wrong, doesn't matter, these properties still apply. Okay, so far we've shown that, let me see how I'm doing on time here. So far we've shown that descending clock auctions can reduce the computational burden, give us something that we can actually compute. They're obviously strategy proof and group strategy proof if we can't make side payments. What about these other four properties about balancing cost minimization, accommodating budget constraints, producing competitive market clearing prices, and preserving winner privacy, uniquely in fact. And what I'm going to show you, what the rest of this talk is going to be about is those four things and some simulations. So I'm going to prove to you, and I'll probably skip over part of this because of the composition of the audience. I'll make statements without making complete arguments. But in fact, we can vary the auction in a way that reduces its cost, which the government cares about because its net revenue is revenues minus costs. We can we have to respect a budget constraint. We can vary the auction to respect a budget constraint and still stay within the class, which you can't do with a Vickrey auction. We can produce competitive market clearing prices, and we can preserve winner privacy. Let me try to give you an informal idea of all of this before I plunge into the formalities. So the cost minimization objective is the hardest one, so let me give you a sense of how we do the other three. So, or at least how we do number 5 and number 7. Can accommodate budget constraints. What we're going to do to accommodate budget constraints is this. As we lower the prices in the auction, we eventually reach a point where the auction would end, and we say, gee, the cost is too high. Well, what do we do then? Well, what we do then is we keep lowering the prices. We might have to cancel the procurement if we can't meet the budget, but we keep lowering the prices. Well, when we keep lowering the prices, we still have a descending clock auction. So it's in this class, everything that I've shown you applies. You can take any descending clock auction and create what I call a budget-respecting extension of it, where if when you get to the end, the costs are too high, you just keep lowering the prices, and it's still a descending clock auction. So that's how we're going to accommodate budget constraints. Preserving winner privacy, this is going to be very technical, but the idea is really very simple. You're sitting there and you have your station, you sir, you have a station that's worth $5 million to you, and for all I know it might be worth $10 or $15 million to you, and I say, will you take 30? And you say, yeah, I'd take 30. I say, oh, I don't need that, 27, 25, 20. Eventually get down to 22, and it turns out that at that point, there's no more room for you on the air, so I can't lower your price anymore. I can't risk you saying, no, you want to continue broadcasting. I pay you $22 million, so your station must be worth less than $22 million. But I don't know anything else more than that. I don't know whether it was worth 20 or 15 or 5 or 2. All I know is that you were willing to take $22 million. The value to you, your value as a winner is private. All I know is that your price is less than the price I paid you. And that's called preserving winner privacy. And these are basically the only auctions that preserve winner privacy. So I've described to you in informal terms 5 and 7. 4 and 6 are going to be important. Well, especially 4 is going to be important. That's going to be a little more technical, and I'll tell you about it next. Okay. Okay. So I am going to skip a little bit of stuff here. This is, mathematicians would love this stuff. Any of you, I don't know how many of you studied math, but there's an object in combinatorial mathematics called matroids, and they play an important role in this, in the theoretical analysis here, because they identify the set of cases in which a clock auction works perfectly, which is to say that if this is the definition, and I'm not, for this general audience, I'm not going to do it in detail for you, but if the constraints, if the sets that we're able to fit on describe a matroid, then a descending clock auction actually solves the optimization problem. If the thing is a matroid, then the set that would be selected by a greedy algorithm actually solves the optimization problem exactly. That's all you need to know about matroids here today. And and remember, the clock auction is a greedy algorithm, so it means we can set up the clock auction so that it too is exactly efficient. Okay, now why do I tell you this when we're interested in cost minimization? Because I don't have to make the objective the values. I can, and here's the clock auction that does the same thing. So you just lower the prices, and anyway, the clock auction does the same thing. But why am I telling you about this? Okay, so I'm going to spend, I'm going to bore the non-technical people here so the economists see this in a little bit more detail, because this is perhaps one of the most surprising parts about the whole thing. And I should find out how big a part of the audience is in here. How many people know about Roger Meyerson's optimal auction work? Okay, enough of you to make this a short deviation worthwhile, so the rest of you can take a few breaths for a moment. So Roger Meyerson formulated the first time in 35 years ago, the problem of designing an auction to maximize expected revenue, or what's the same thing here as minimize expected costs. This is minimizing the expected sum of the payments to the bidders. And if you write the problem down for this context, it looks almost exactly the same. That is, you minimize expected costs. You have to provide an incentive for bidders to report truthfully. You have to make sure that the bidders are willing to participate, that they all earn at least 0. And you have a physical feasibility constraint. In Meyerson's case, it was that you have exactly one item for sale. Here we have a different physical feasibility constraint, one that's much more complicated. It's that however we select things, it has to be that the support of the distribution of allocations that we select lies in the set of feasible allocations, no matter what it is bidders say. So this problem looks exactly the same except for the last line as the problem that Roger Meyerson solved. And if you follow, and Meyerson's a Nobel laureate who all the economists here know well, as I gather he has connections here to Ukraine as well. If you then follow Meyerson's analysis, you get exactly the same analysis. The only thing that looks different is that instead of requiring that the object be assigned only once, you end up requiring that the assignments you make are always feasible. All the other steps go through just the same, and it amounts to minimizing the expected sum of what Meyerson would call a virtual cost function. Well, if the F describes a matroid, then you can do this exactly by a greedy algorithm in which you greedily take the guy who has the highest virtual cost and say, no, I'm not buying you, you broadcast. And the guy who has the next highest virtual cost and say, no, I'm not buying you, you continue. It's just you can find the exact solution by a greedy algorithm. And the theorem says that here's the clock auction that implements that greedy algorithm. You can write this down, and you can find an auction that actually minimizes the expected cost of procurement exactly in the case when where the constraints describe a matroid. Okay, so this is going to motivate what we actually do, but the idea is that we can take into account costs. We don't have to just be setting prices to maximize value of the stations that are on the air. We can also move in the direction of minimizing costs, and we're going to save a lot of money that way, as you'll see. Okay, accommodate budget constraints. I've already described to you informally how this goes on. The general idea is that after the auction reaches the limit, if the prices are unacceptable, you just keep dropping the prices and call that thing a budget-respecting extension. And the theorem is that every budget-respecting extension of a descending clock auction is another descending clock auction. So all the properties that I've described can be preserved, including respecting budget, within the context of descending clock auctions. Okay, and I think I might spend less time on this because this will mean I'll say a few moments. I have time to talk to the economists again for a moment. There's a question about what we might mean by market clearing prices in this context. Market clearing prices normally means everybody's optimizing, but we can't optimize, so what would market clearing mean? And so what we do is we say, well, suppose that we have some rule for alpha for selecting winners in an auction. Given some prices, here's what we would demand at some function of the prices, any function of the prices. Then we're going to say that something is an alpha competitive equilibrium if the sellers are optimizing. So if I offer you a price that's higher than what it's worth to you, you sell. And if I offer you a price that's less than what it's worth to you, you don't sell. And the buyer is using alpha to decide what it accepts. That's what I mean by an alpha. It's the natural extension of competitive equilibrium to the case where I can't optimize. And the theorem is that these auctions charge competitive prices. That is, let S be the set of winners from a descending clock auction when the bidders' values are given by this vector V, describes what the values are to all the bidders, and take a look at who the winners are, and then set prices where the winners are charged the prices that come out of this auction, and the losers are charged prices equal to their own values. And that is a competitive equilibrium. That means that if you were to tell the seller, not the bidder's values, but just tell the seller, here are the prices that you're facing, the seller would say, okay, great. The auctioneer would say, great, I'll still select the same set of winners. I don't need to know what those values were. I make the same selection anyway. And these are also the kind of thing that would happen if the bidders were well informed in an ordinary sealed bid auction. Okay, and the Victory auctions don't have this property generally. Victory auctions can lead to prices that are too high, that if the seller knew he was going to have to pay that much, he'd say, no, I don't want to pay that. But these auctions never lead to prices like that. Okay. Okay, I am, this part is perhaps the most technical part, so I think I won't go over it in detail for here. Instead, I'll try to tell you in informal terms what it means. So we're going to wind up with a theorem that says that every auction in this class has two properties. It's going to satisfy winner privacy, which I described to you before, and ex post incentive compatibility. That is, it's always going to be in your interest. You won't regret how you bid in this auction. At the end, if you find out what everybody else did, you'll say, yeah, I did the best I could. So every auction in this class has that property. And moreover, if you have some outcome that can be implemented by any protocol that you made up, any communication protocol that has those properties, that it preserves winner privacy and has ex post incentive compatibility, then it can be implemented by a descending clock auction with truthful bidding. So this characterizes preserving privacy and being incentive compatible, it being optimal to report truthfully. Those characterize this class of auctions. This is the unique class with those properties. Okay, and again, I'm being a little bit informal here, but that's the gist of what this theorem says. And the rest of these slides describe in technical terms what preserving winner privacy means and what ex post incentive compatibility means. Okay, so to recap, let's see what time it is. Okay, I've got 15 minutes about. So to recap where we are, what we did is we created a new class of auction designs that include in them ones with much lower computational burden and that are obviously strategy proof, so the bidders don't need to trust the auctioneer in order to know how to bid. They're group strategy proof, so that no group of bidders can get together without making side payments and make themselves all better off. They can accommodate a cost minimization objective. That is, we can adjust the way we compute prices to keep our total cost lower. In fact, in certain cases, we can actually achieve the optimum and minimize the expected cost by adapting the prices well. We can accommodate budget constraints so that if the prices are too high, we just keep the auction running and try to meet the budget constraint or cancel if we can't afford the procurement without affecting any of the other properties. We can produce competitive market clearing prices so that at the prices that eventually emerge, the seller doesn't say, gee, if I knew that those were going to be the prices, I would want something else. And we can preserve winner privacy, which again, in this particular application wasn't that important, but in some applications, it turns out it's more important. So those are the 7 properties that I verified that this whole class of auctions has, and the Victory auction doesn't have any of these properties. So so these are 7 advantages compared to the best state-of-the-art design that existed before we began this work. Okay. Now, so that's all theory. How does this work in practice? So, how does it perform? So we ran some simulations to determine how this would perform, and we used some publicly available estimates of what people thought the stations might be worth. It was random. It was a model with random values, so we generated values from the model and ran them through the auction. But the problem that we had, and the first problem that you have, is that we can't compute an optimum, so how can we compare this to anything? The optimum isn't computable. So what we decided to do is, oops, so I haven't told you, okay. What we decided to do was to do a limited simulation. Now there's something I'd forgotten to tell you that comes first, which is what pricing rule did we actually use for the Federal Communication Commission? So this is I'm going to show you the actual rule that we actually used for the Federal Communications Commission incentive auction, and it was this. It was that in any round for station N is the index that indexes the station, in round T, if there's no place to put the station, if we don't have room for it on the air, given the other commitments we made, we don't lower its price. We say, we're done. We offered you $30 million. You said yes. We're buying your station for $30 million. End of story. Okay? But if we do have room for your station, then we lower your price, and we set a price that's proportional to this base clock price. You may remember the example I gave you. It was a price per unit of space in the knapsack times your size in the knapsack. Well, here it's a price that's a base price times two factors: your population, the population covered to the power 0.5, times the number of interference links you had in that graph I showed you, also to the power 0.5. That was the rule. Very simple rule. What we wrote in the report and order was that if a station caused interference with twice as many other stations and served twice as large a population, we ought to be offering it twice as large a price, and we're going to weight links and population equally, and that leads to this formula. Okay? What's that? Yeah, all right. So that was the formula we used, and our intention in these two factors, this population factor is a virtual cost factor. There's where we're picking up Meyerson. We know that we believe that we have good evidence that stations that serve larger populations are more valuable, and we did a bunch of calculations, and we decided that we could link, that by linking prices to population, we would be able to reduce the cost in the auction. And the second factor is links to the power 0.5, and that was going to be some measure of the station's size, how hard it was to fit in other things if you put that in. You remember in the knapsack problem, if I put in something big, I don't have room for as many other valuable things. Well, here, if I put in a station that has a lot of interference links, that's going to make it harder to put in more other stations. It heuristically corresponds to the idea of size. So those were the two adjustments we made, one to make the packing more efficient, and the other to reduce the procurement cost. Okay, thank you. And so for the simulation results are for a problem that include, so we can't solve the optimization for the whole country, so what we did is we took basically a 500-mile radius around New York City, which gives us a smaller problem that's just barely solvable. And we were able to compute the Vickrey outcomes, which is the state-of-the-art old algorithm. And these are the results of the simulation. So for each, and we simulated a half a dozen examples. The simulations took a lot of computation time, so we only did 6 of them. Each computation of the Vickrey auction took 90 CPU days. Each computation of our heuristic auction took 1.5 CPU hours. Okay, 90 CPU days versus 1.5 CPU hours. This is much more computable and sort of begins to explain why when we try to do it at the level of the whole country, we couldn't do it at all for the Vickrey auction, and we could do it fast for our own auction. Efficiency can be measured a couple of different ways. You can think of yourselves as putting the most valuable stations on the air, or you can think of yourselves as taking the least valuable stations off the air. Those are the same problem, but when you measure efficiency, you usually you take a ratio of the objectives. You say, well, what's the value of the stations I took off the air? What's the lowest value it could have been? What's the value of the stations I put on the air? What's the highest value that could have been? And it turns out that it's easy to achieve very high efficiency when you're looking at the maximization problem of stations on the air. Because we had 3,000 stations, we're only taking 175 of them off the air, and they're the least valuable ones. All the valuable stations are left on the air, and there's a large number of them. So, of course, we got extremely high efficiencies when you measure it that way, but that doesn't say much. The more interesting thing is looking at the minimization problem. And remember, we weren't trying to minimize the value of the stations taken off the air. We have some balance of cost and efficiency. Nevertheless, in these simulations, we averaged 95% efficiency, which is quite high. So we're moving, but we're moving away from efficiency in the direction of cost minimization. And the cost minimization results, I think, are spectacular. We used 100 to represent the cost index for the Vickrey auction. And by that measure, the clock auctions that we ran achieved a cost of 76. They saved about 25% in cost by making this adjustment. This was a $10 billion auction, so if that's just 3/4 of what it should cost, that means that we saved the US taxpayer about $3 billion by doing this instead of aiming for full efficiency and achieving and running a Vickrey auction. So those are, I hope you will agree, pretty good results. And I actually sped up more than I needed to, it turns out, because I think I'm just about at the end here. Yeah, I am just about at the end here. So, so the gist of this is that, and so I'll get to tell you a little bit more about the other hard problem that we were solving here, since I raced through the reverse auction. The gist of it is that we created a new class of auctions and proved theoretical properties for them. These hard problems of the graph coloring problem that I described to you that was so hard, we spent years working on algorithms to be able to solve those problems really well. And in fact, of the 10,000 problems that we faced during the course of the auction, we timed out on only a single-digit number of them. So there don't exist any algorithms that are guaranteed to succeed all the time. We had timeout failures on a single-digit number out of 10,000 problems that we faced during the auction. So that was really good performance on the operations research side. And in fact, my team and the team at the FCC who were working on this won the Edelman Prize from Informs this year. There's a prize given internationally for the best application of analytical methods and operations research. And the team that did this work on being able to very fast solve these graph coloring problems won that international prize for 2017. So I congratulate my teammates for their part of it. The other thing I guess I just have a moment to tell you about, since I'm not quite out of time yet, is how we decided how much spectrum to clear. And, oops, where are we? Nope. How about here and here? Where was it? Okay. Oh well. This slide, I'll do this one last. I raced over this slide, and I wanted to give you some idea of why budget constraints were important and how we decided how much spectrum to clear. And the gist of the idea was that we started with very high opening bids to encourage the broadcasters to participate, extremely high bids to encourage broadcasters to participate. And then we ran the reverse auction, and we set a very high clearing target. We tried initially to clear 126 megahertz of spectrum, which would have been a massive target. And then we ran the auction, and the cost of clearing 126 megahertz would have been $85 billion, which is completely crazy. Then we ran the forward auction, which came out to be a number that was much lower than that. And so we said, well, gee, we can't clear 126 megahertz. Well, what do you do? Well, what you do is we go back and say, okay, we're going to clear a smaller amount. We'll continue to lower the prices. This is why the ability to adjust to a limited budget was so important. We couldn't meet that budget, so we continued to lower the prices. And then in the forward auction, as we said, well, we don't have that much supply available, we continued to raise the prices. And we had to do that a grand total of 4 times during the, well, we went through 4 stages. We had to restart 3 times during the course of the auction till we eventually drove the cost down to $10 billion and the revenue up to $20 billion. And that's what this all describes. We set an initial clearing target, a target number of channels, run the reverse and forward auction, see whether we've satisfied the condition for closing. If no, we reduce the spectrum clearing target and continue the auction. And the fact that the auction is still strategy proof and still has all these nice properties, even after we restart it, was critical to make this process function. So that's it. That's what I have to tell you about this auction. I think that there are applications coming up in Ukraine. Sorry, I think there are applications coming up in Ukraine that involve, for example, in the 800 megahertz spectrum and the 900 megahertz spectrum, where there are incumbents trying to get those incumbents to give up some of their spectrum. I think you have to create competition among them. I think that might mean clearing either 800 or 900, but not necessarily both, in order that the incumbents have to compete against each other to get paid. And I think that it may very well be possible to use similar ideas to try to improve spectrum allocation here. Thank you very much.
I'll check. Are there any questions? We might have a time for 1 question or 2, if there are any. There are some questions, but Mike, go ahead, and then we'll ask. Mike, go ahead.
No, if there are other questions, I'll...
You had a question? Yeah.
You mentioned efficiency of auctions, of 2 different kinds of auction. What is the criteria of efficiency? No, what is the criteria of, what is the goal of auctions? It's maximization of profit or some kind of fair distribution of frequencies in that way? What is the goal of that auctions? You measured efficiency.
Right. Well, oops, sorry. In the simulations, the way we measured efficiency is we took a look at the value of the stations that we bought and that we were removing from the air, and we took a look at the minimum value of stations that we would have to remove from the air to allow feasible packing, and we compared the 2. And if the value of the stations at the auction removed from the air was higher, which of course it was, than the minimum possible value, the difference was what we call inefficiency. That's how we defined it.
And second question, this mechanism, it works even for single auction or just for series of auction as a market transforming instrument?
No, so the 2 pieces together were for the market transforming. The reverse auction can work for a single procurement auction, yes.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? Oh, there's one. Okay.
My name is Sergey, represent Better Regulation Delivery Office. My name is Sergey. I work for Better Regulation Delivery Office, and we are partly engaged with the auction reforms. So there are doubts whether it's completely your clock auction strategy approach is absolutely, completely group strategy proof. Let's assume the situation when we, let's say, at the last pending stage of the auction, and there are 2 bidders remain. Providing that they know each other, they still may collude, and the latter one remains, the former one drops out and just receives his kickback, let's say. So is it possible to tackle this possible collusion or not?
Yeah, so the theory describes group strategy proofness, and that means that if there's no way to compensate the loser outside the auction, then then there's no gain to the colluders. We know that in practice, and that's an important, by the way, property, because the compensation, especially if it's paid in cash, often leaves a paper trail, and it's easier to prosecute that kind of compensation. But no, if the bidders either compensate in cash or they compensate by returning favors in some other way, this theorem does not apply to that. Those things do, if the bidders know each other and compete repeatedly, they can often find ways to collude that escape, that are not covered by this theorem.
All right. Thank you. Mike?
So Paul, first thank you for a wonderful talk. And every time I see this result about kind of two auctions essentially running concurrently, I really marvel at that, because it's really beautiful the way the reallocation works with this. And I wonder, and it seems like a very, very general thing where you need to reallocate, so it would make sense to have two auctions running concurrently. So I wonder if this is the first time ever that this, I think, really brilliant idea was used, or if there are precedents of something like that done, perhaps in different settings for reallocation purposes.
So what is usually reallocated, so what we did is unprecedented in some ways. What's usually reallocated is the ownership of, let's say securities or real estate or something where what you're buying and selling are the same thing. And then you typically don't have to run two auctions. In fact, normally you run one auction that have bids and offers for the same thing. What makes the spectrum reallocation different is we weren't buying and selling the same thing. We were buying TV broadcast licenses and selling mobile broadband licenses, and they don't convert one for one into another. So this required those auctions to be separate. There's no transaction between a seller and a buyer individually that makes any sense. It's only the whole transaction that makes sense. And to the best of my knowledge, this is unprecedented, yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Paul. Let's give Paul a round of applause. Thank you. And we're going to move to our next speaker, Paul Klemperer.